A Secret History of Consciousness, written by Gary Lachman, narrated by Russell Newton. Copyright 2003 by Lindisframe PR. Production copyright by Spoken Tome Media. You need to hear this. Forward by Colin Wilson. When Rudolf Steiner was a teenager, he was irritated by a fellow student who professed to believe that human beings are nothing but machines, and asked him angrily why, in that case, he used the phrase, "I think," instead of saying, "my brain thinks." Of course, there was no way for Steiner to win the argument. Whatever he said, his friend could reply, "You're merely responding mechanically to a desire to win the argument." And if Steiner replied, "Then the same is true of you," would agree blandly, "That's what I'm saying." You could say that this infuriating old controversy is Gary Lachman's starting point in this book, for he feels much the same about the arguments of philosophers like Francis Crick and John Searle, but he does not devote much space to them, no doubt recognizing that readers who open a book called A Secret History of Consciousness are not going to spend too much time worrying about the 21st century version of outdated 19th century materialism. Presumably, such readers have picked up this book because they're interested in the tradition that links figures as disparate as Steiner, Richard Maurice Bucke, Gurdjieff, Ouspensky, Schwaller de Lubitz, and Jean Gebser, in which case they don't much care what Francis Crick thinks. T.S. Eliot once criticized Bertrand Russell's essay, A Free Man's Worship, on the grounds that it was not for people who hunger and thirst after righteousness, so much as for those who are content with a snack at the bar. Whether the thinkers discussed in this book hunger and thirst after righteousness is a matter for discussion, but one thing is certain, all of them undoubtedly hunger and thirst after something, and this is why I find them so fascinating, and why I read Gary Lachman's book with such deep interest. It should be stated, before I go any further, that Gary Lachman is not, as the reader might suppose from the remarkable breadth of his knowledge, an academic or even a psychologist. He's already well known to lovers of rock music as the guitarist in a 70s group called Blondie, and his song, "I'm Always Touched by Your Presence, Dear," was in the top 10. He tells the story of these years in his book, New York Rocker. But during this period when he was a pop idol, all his spare time was spent reading philosophy and esoteric literature. And in 1983, he embarked on his own search for the miraculous, visiting places like Gurdjieff's Prieuré in Fontainebleau, Chartres Cathedral, Glastonbury, Stonehenge, and other sacred sites. When I met him in the late 1980s, he was studying philosophy at California State University and working in the huge metaphysical bookshop, The Bodhi Tree, in Hollywood. He was working on an occult novel that I found fascinating. Then, in 1996, he moved to London and embarked on the career of a professional writer, writing Turn Off Your Mind, The Mystic 60s, and then New York Rocker. Readers of the present book will sense that his interest in the problem of the transformation of consciousness is immediate and personal. Let me try to define the problem that preoccupies us both. A small number of human beings differ from their fellows in feeling basically dissatisfied with what living in this world has to offer them. They suffer from the same kind of profound discontentment as Bunyan's hero, who could think of nothing but, "What can I do to be saved?" I must emphasize immediately that such people do not necessarily regard themselves as religious. Perhaps, like myself, they spent too much of their childhood bored to tears in church or Sunday school, and automatically react with hostility to the kind of bleeding that clergymen indulge in. But whether they know it or not, they are reacting to the same peculiar dissatisfaction that has characterized truly religious people throughout the ages. They are revolted and enraged by the hymn that declares, "The trivial round, the common task should furnish all we ought to ask." As far as they're concerned, a life devoted to the trivial round is not worth living. Now, Although such people strike most of their fellows as rather peculiar, they always seem to form a certain small percentage of society, and have done so throughout the ages. Those who were lucky enough to be born in Europe in, say, the 13th century, simply explained to their families that they wished to become novices and went off to the nearest monastery. And although they were probably required to milk the cows and grind the corn into flour, they had no objection to this trivial round of everyday chores. For as they listened to the chanting of the monks at evensong, or took part in the Easter festival, they felt themselves to be part of a world that satisfied a hunger of the spirit. These natural contemplatives experienced disquiet when reformers, like Luther and Calvin and Huss, denounced the church as corrupt, for the religious temperament is naturally conservative and feels no desire to challenge authority. They were not even too concerned to learn that Canon Copernicus had propounded a new theory in which the earth was no longer the center of the universe, for Copernicus admitted that it was no more than a theory. But this was not the end of the matter. Soon, Galileo was declaring that Copernicus was right and the Pope was wrong, while the respected philosopher Descartes suggested that the only reliable way to arrive at truth was through reason, and that although reason supported the existence of God, the first step towards certain knowledge was to doubt everything. Then, Sir Isaac Newton demonstrated that the universe is a gigantic clock which ticks on for all eternity without any help from God. And by this time, half of Europe had become Protestant, and the old, comfortable world of the 13th century had been lost forever. We can now see that, historically speaking, this had to happen, but it meant that those natural misfits and outsiders who had found their natural home in the church no longer had anywhere to go. They had, in fact, become refugees, displaced persons. So when in the 1880s, an Armenian Greek named George Gurdjieff experienced the familiar dissatisfaction of the spiritual refugee, he had no idea where to start looking for a way of life that would satisfy that particular hunger that tormented him. It is true that he was deeply religious, and if he'd been born a generation earlier, would almost certainly have entered the Orthodox Church and ended his life with the reputation of a saint. But it was already too late for that. Instead, Gurdjieff wandered off to Egypt, then Abyssinia and Syria, then India, searching for a lost knowledge that he felt had to exist somewhere. And after many years of searching, he claims he was part of a group called the Seekers After Truth. He came to the conclusion that the answer he was looking for did not lie in some ancient monastery in the Himalayas. It lay rather in the sphere of man's unconscious mentation, that is, in the depth of the unconscious mind. Now, if I may speak personally for a moment, I came across Gurdjieff's name about 1950 when, in a bookshop in Kensington Church Street, I saw a squat, bulky volume entitled All and Everything. And ever since I reached my teens, I had been possessed by an absurd desire to know about every important idea of the 20th century. I was deeply curious to know what Gurdjieff had to say that required well over 1,000 pages. A glance into the book convinced me that he had no capacity for expressing himself in plain language, and I temporarily admitted defeat. Not long after that, I found a volume called In Search of the Miraculous by P.D. Wyspinski in the Wimbledon Public Library and was delighted to see that it was about the teaching of Gurdjieff. And since it seemed to be clearly written, I took it home and plunged in. But I soon found myself bogged down in obscure passages about the ray of creation and octaves, and decided that, after all, this was not for me. Fortunately, a few weeks later, I came upon a volume called Venture with Ideas by Kenneth Walker, and realized that this was a simple personal account of Gurdjieff and Wyspinski. And using Kenneth Walker as a key, I was soon making great strides with In Search of the Miraculous, and knew that I had stumbled upon one of the most important books of my life. One of the things that impressed me most about Gurdjieff's teaching was his assertion that we are little more than machines. This is something I had felt obscurely since my teens, and it had crystallized when I read in T.S. Eliot's The Family Reunion the line, "partial observation of one's own automatism." I would have liked to be quite a different kind of person, self-possessed, focused, articulate, but my body and brain seemed to have a will of their own, and I sometimes felt that I was in charge of a shambling Frankenstein monster. Persuading him to do what I wanted was as difficult as driving one of those dodgem cars in an amusement park, which refuses to go the way you want it to. But even when I outgrew the sense of clumsiness and awkwardness, I remained aware of this mechanical element in the human personality that I called the automatic pilot, the part of us that learns to type or drive a car or talk a foreign language. This I eventually came to call the robot. This robot is also responsible for something that preoccupied me greatly in my teens, mental illness. So many of those 19th century figures I admired, Van Gogh, Nietzsche, Hölderlin, had gone insane, and I could understand the mechanism. Every one of us is part robot, part living entity, the real you. Under normal circumstances, we seem to be about 50-50. When you set out for work on a spring morning, you are more like 51% real you and only 49% robot. Yet by the time you come home, you may be so tired that you drive home automatically and can hardly remember the drive. Your robot has driven you home. The problem arises when you feel overwhelmed with difficulties and complications, and you plod along mechanically, hardly recalling what it was like when you really enjoyed life. You cease to make the kind of effort that recharges your vital batteries. You're now habitually more robot than real you, and this is a highly dangerous state. For if we allow ourselves to slip down to the state of being 55% robot and only 45% real you, it is very hard to recover. Tiredness makes you pessimistic. Pessimism makes you tired. It's a vicious circle in which it seems self-evident that living is bloody hard work and that no one can be called truly happy. We cease to feel those flashes of sheer delight, those moments that Chesterton called absurd good news, and Proust, moment bien heureux. Life takes on the quality of a play by Samuel Beckett, and it is surely a sign of how many people in our civilization live permanently in this state that Beckett is vaguely accepted as a great writer. In short, although the robot is the most valuable servant we possess, he's also responsible for most of the things that are wrong with our civilization. And all these problems depend on the negative feedback mechanism, tiredness leading to depression, depression to more tiredness. This explains why so much modern thought is tinged with gloom, from the psychology of Freud to the philosophy of Heidegger, Sartre, and their successors. Yet, as Gary Lachman points out, not all serious thinkers end up in this pessimistic cul-de-sac. Abraham Maslow complained that Freud had sold human nature short and landed us in a radical underestimation of our own partners. He pointed out that all healthy and normal people have regular peak experiences, a close relative of Proust's moments bien heureux. But he also made an observation of crucial importance. When his students began to talk to one another about their peak experiences, they began having peak experiences all the time. It is as if reminding yourself of their existence is enough to make them happen. We've seen the same mechanism in Bucke's experience of cosmic consciousness, which occurred after he had spent an evening with friends talking and reading Wordsworth, Whitman, and Browning. The discussion had made him aware that he ought to be happy, and the happiness descended as he relaxed in the cab. This raises an interesting question. If peak experiences are so natural, why do most people experience them so seldom? The answer is fairly obvious. We don't spend most of our lives considering whether we are happy or unhappy. We spend them in practical considerations, catching buses, paying bills, watching the news. Happiness tends to come in moments of relaxation or withdrawal. Maslow describes a young mother who was getting breakfast for her husband and children when a beam of sunlight came through the window, and it suddenly struck her how lucky she was, and she went into the peak experience. Of course, she was lucky before it happened, but it took the sunlight to give her a lift that carried her into the peak experience. The trouble, I concluded long ago, is that close-upness deprives us of meaning. We spend our lives peering at the present, like a watchmaker peering at cogs and springs through his eyeglass. The result is rather like a short-sighted man in a picture gallery who is forced to study the pictures from 2 inches away and so seldom gets the full impact. The present acts like a bullfighter's cape, which prevents the bull from seeing the matador. Every time it charges, it is blinded by the cape. This is the perfect example of what Gurdjieff meant by mechanicalness. A really intelligent bull would fix the matador with its mind, ignore the cape, and charge at where it knows the matador to be. But most bulls are too mechanical to do anything so intelligent. In the Moment Ben Hello, the matador stands back and drops the cape, and we can see things as they are, and plunge into the peak experience. Of course, the trouble is not only close-upness, but also the negativity that has somehow crept into our whole outlook on life. And the culprit here is thought itself. This has now been recognized by a school of psychiatry in America, of whom the leading exponent is a professor called George Pransky. He refers to it as the psychology of mind. In his book, The Renaissance of Psychology, Pransky describes how he was persuaded to attend a session at Salt Spring Island off the coast of British Columbia. He was struck by the sheer cheerfulness and well-being of the participants. But what really impressed him was that the person at the center of this revival was an ordinary man named Sid Banks, not a psychologist or an academic or even a minister. And Banks's insight had come upon him with absurd simplicity. He'd been remarking to a friend that he felt unhappy, and the friend had replied, "You're not unhappy, Sid. You only think you are." And Banks stared at him with amazement and said, "What did you say?" As the incredible implications sank in, he suddenly saw that all our mental states are things we happen to think are so. When George Pransky told me this story, I told him one of my own favorites. A man is on his way to borrow a neighbor's lawnmower for the 10th time. He imagines the neighbor saying, "But why don't you buy one of your own?" And he replies, "It just isn't worth it." And his neighbor says, "Yes, but surely." At this moment, he knocks on the neighbor's door, and as the man opens it, he shouts, "Oh, keep your bloody lawnmower," and strides off. This is an example of the kind of thing Banks means. It is our minds that create problems and inflate them. But if we practice Gurdjieff's self-observation, we soon recognize that most of the things we think we see and understand are patterns created by our own minds, like faces seen in the clouds. And the cinema screen on which we project these shapes is the bullfighter's cape, the present moment. If we could learn to brush the cape aside, everything would be different. For, as Blake realized, if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear as it really is, infinite. That is why, on the whole, I tend to be an optimist. As I study modern philosophy, from Heidegger and Sartre to Derrida and Lyotard, as I study modern literature, from Eliot's Wasteland to Beckett and Golding's Lord of the Flies, I see men who have convinced themselves that the faces they see in the clouds, and make the rest of us see, are objectively real. Buckminster Fuller went straight to the heart of the matter with his comment, "I seem to be a verb." We came closest to understanding our own mystery when we grasped the meaning of this comment. If everyday consciousness shares the nature of sleep, then the problem is to shake the mind awake. Here, I would suggest, we have a fruitful starting point for this problem. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov remarks that if he had to stand on a narrow ledge forever, in eternal rain and darkness, he would still prefer to do this rather than die at once. We can all understand just what he meant, that if someone put a gun to our heads and said, "Which is it to be? Do I blow your brains out, or will you choose the narrow ledge?" we would all cry, "Narrow ledge." But what would we actually do on that narrow ledge? The director of BBC Music, Hans Keller, once described how he had been in Germany before the Second World War, when so many of his acquaintances were disappearing into concentration camps, and had prayed, "Only let me get out of Germany, and I swear I will never be unhappy for the rest of my life." And again, we can all see what he meant, but how could he actually set about keeping his promise? Gary Lachman mentions in this book the story of how Graham Greene had temporarily escaped his own boredom by playing Russian roulette with a loaded revolver, and how, when the hammer fell on an empty chamber, he felt an overwhelming sense of delight, of relief. In that moment, he had actually become a verb. But how do we set about becoming a verb? Shaw embodied his own answer to the problem in Heartbreak House, in Captain Shotover's phrase, "the seventh degree of concentration." And we can see that a hammer clicking on the empty chamber of a loaded revolver would, indeed, bring about something very like the seventh degree of concentration. In this remarkable book, Gary Lachman has approached this problem from many different angles. What all have in common is that they embody the idea that human consciousness is now evolving toward a new level. This is the basis of the teachings of Madame Blavatsky and Rudolf Steiner, and it appears in Bucke, Gurdjieff, Ouspensky, Owen Barfield, Maslow, Schwaller de Lubicz, and Jean Gebser. And it also seems to me obvious that, as in the case of Maslow's students, we can only deepen our awareness of this step in evolution by talking and thinking about it. That is to say, a book like this is, in itself, an important step toward the evolution it discusses. I stumbled upon an interesting insight several years ago, in fact, to be specific, in March 1987, after an incident involving a ferry called the Herald of Free Enterprise. Its captain made the mistake of allowing it to leave port with the car doors open, which was strictly illegal. A wave rolled into the ship, causing it to capsize with great loss of life. And as I thought about this, I found myself reflecting how easy it would have been to avert this tragedy, if only someone had walked up to the captain and threatened to report him if he did not order the doors closed before leaving port. But then I became aware of the paradox. If the tragedy had been averted, no one would have known, and so no one would have felt happiness and relief. We can even imagine that if one of the passengers had been a depressive, he might have thrown himself overboard on the return journey. Reflecting on this makes me aware of what Gurdjieff meant when he said that what man needs to save him from the state of illusion in which he lives is an organ that would permit him to see the exact time of his own death. Let me add to that another reflection, that what we now need is an organ by which we can perceive the tragedies and miseries we might well encounter every day of our lives, but which we normally succeed in avoiding. It may sound as if I am suggesting that we should spend our lives in a state of anxiety about possible disasters, but that is not at all what I mean. On the contrary, I'm suggesting using the imagination actively, like Maslow's housewife, to grasp how lucky we are. 40 years ago, I compiled the first ever Encyclopedia of Murder. I tried to explain in the introduction why I did not regard the study of murder as somehow morbid or sensational, because when you contemplate the idea of a criminal who has thrown away his freedom, you are galvanized into a recognition of the value of your own freedom. For example, at the time I write this, a friend named Ira Einhorn has just been sentenced to life imprisonment on a murder charge. I am not now raising the question of whether he is guilty or not, only the fact that he is an intelligent man who would certainly have better things to do with his life than spend it behind bars. And if I happen to be tired or worried about some relatively trivial problem, and then I remember Ira's present predicament, I am instantly restored to an objective view of my situation. My own problems are reduced to a size that makes them almost invisible. Gary Lachman believes, and I concur, that some basic changes have happened in human consciousness over the past 4,000 years. The change to reflective self-awareness that occurred with what Julian Jaynes calls the breakdown of the bicameral mind around 1250 BC. The change to perspectival consciousness at sometime around 1336, when Petrarch climbed Mount Ventoux, and the astonishing change that occurred around 1750 with the birth of Romanticism. If Gebser is correct, the greatest change is yet to occur. This is the change to integral consciousness, defined by George Feuerstein as consciousness that does not seek escape from the present. That is why it seems to me that it is wholly appropriate that Gebser should occupy the place he does, at the end of this book, where the reader will be in a position to judge the remarkable extent of his contribution. For to grasp what is meant by integral consciousness is to have taken the most important step toward achieving it. Part 1. The Search for Cosmic Consciousness. Chapter 1. R.M. Bucke and the Future of Humanity. In 1901, a book with the intriguing title Cosmic Consciousness appeared in Philadelphia in a limited edition of 500 copies. Its author was Richard Maurice Bucke, a doctor and former medical superintendent of the Asylum for the Insane in London, Ontario. Although at first the book made little impression on the reading public, interest in its remarkable claim that humanity was slowly evolving into a new, higher level of consciousness attracted attention, and soon its readers included the psychologist William James and the esoteric philosopher P.D. Wyszynski. More than half a century later, it had acquired even greater popularity. By 1966, Cosmic Consciousness had gone through 26 printings and had become, along with Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, Aldous Huxley's The Doors of Perception, and J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, part of the canon of works firing the imagination of a burgeoning counterculture. Burke's background was not what one might expect for the head of an insane asylum, nor for that matter, the author of a book arguing that the human race was moving into a higher state of consciousness. Born in 1837 to English parents, who soon after emigrated to Canada, Bucke left home at 17 after the death of his stepmother and spent the next 4 years piling up enough adventures for a dozen enterprising young men. Crossing the border into the United States, he traveled across the country, working at a variety of jobs. He was a gardener in Ohio, a railway man in Cincinnati, and a deckhand on a Mississippi steamboat, before finally signing on as a driver on a wagon train heading across the Great Plains to the edge of Mormon territory, today part of Nevada. The journey to Salt Lake took 5 months, and in the 1850s it was a dangerous business. For the last 1,200 miles, there were no white settlements, and the Indians, resentful of the white man's incursion, were not particularly friendly. After this, Bucke crossed the Rockies, was attacked by the Shoshone Indians, and nearly starved, living for a time on flour and hot water. He then settled down as a gold miner. During an attempt to cross a mountain chain in winter, his partner died, and Bucke himself was about to follow when he was discovered by a mining party. Both of his feet were frozen, and all of one foot and part of the other had to be amputated. Bucke was 21, and for the rest of his life, only occasionally would he be free from physical pain. Yet Bucke had the optimism and determination associated with the expanding United States in the 19th century. And this same optimism led him to his master thought, the notion that humanity was evolving into a higher form of consciousness. An inheritance paid his way through medical school and postgraduate work in England, France, and Germany. In 1864, he settled in Canada and set up shop. By 1876, he had been appointed superintendent of an asylum for the insane in Hamilton, Ontario. The next year, he moved to London. He was appointed professor of mental and nervous diseases at Western University. In 1888, he was elected president of the psychological section of the British Medical Association, and in 1890 was given a similar honor by the American Medico-Psychological Association. By the end of the century, Bucke was considered one of North America's foremost alienists, the term used for doctors of the mind before psychologists came into use, and this standing among professionals helped his extraordinary ideas about human evolution gain a hearing they might otherwise have lacked. Bucke's tenacity and application give the impression of a highly practical man, down to earth with an eye to business, suggesting that the picture of him as a philosopher of a radical shift in human consciousness is somewhat incongruous. Although the portrait of him in cosmic consciousness, with his flowing white beard and longish hair, does suggest the air of a prophet. Yet there was another side to Bucke. Growing up on a backwoods Canadian farm, he developed a sensitivity to nature and experienced a powerful curiosity about the basic mysteries of life. At about the age of 10, he felt a strange ecstasy and longing about the notion of death, and was eager to discover if he could find answers to questions about the beyond. Although for the most part uneducated at this time, he was a voracious reader of poetry, and in later life was known to have memorized whole volumes of it. Bucke's father, a graduate of Trinity College, Cambridge, had himself mastered 7 languages, and when he moved the young family from England to the wilds of Ontario, he brought a library of some 1,000 volumes. Bucke grew up in an atmosphere of rugged, hands-on experience, softened by literary discussion. More than likely, it was this that prepared him for his later work as a visionary and prophet. The first sign of that vocation appeared in 1867, when a visitor to Bucke's home quoted some of the poetry of Walt Whitman. The effect was immediate. We do not know which of Whitman's expansive verses was recited, but Bucke was bowled over by it, and from that moment considered himself the poet's disciple. The encounter prompted a wide reading in history, philosophy, and science, and for years afterward, Bucke suffered an unappeasable hunger for enlightenment on the basic problems. 10 years later, Bucke met Whitman and became a central figure in the circle around the poet, even treating him in his medical capacity, successfully, as Whitman later claimed the doctor saved his life. One of the volumes of poetry Bucke was reported to know by heart was Whitman's Leaves of Grass, a remarkable achievement by any standard. 5 years after his introduction to Whitman's poetry, Bucke had the experience that set him on his life's work, and contributed to the language a phrase most people use without the slightest idea of its origin. In his 35th year, during a visit to England, he had his illumination. After an evening spent reading Wordsworth, Shelley, Keats, Browning, and, of course, Whitman, Bucke left his friends around midnight and settled into his hansom cab for the drive to his hotel. The night of poetry had left him calm, and his mind was full of the ideas and feelings stimulated by the evening's discussion. He felt himself in a state of quiet, almost passive enjoyment. And then it happened. All at once, without warning of any kind, he, Bucke wrote his account in the third person, found himself wrapped around, as it were, by a flame-colored cloud. For an instant he thought of fire, some sudden conflagration in the great city. The next instant he knew that the light was within himself. Directly after, there came upon him a sense of exaltation, of immense joyousness, accompanied, or immediately followed, by an intellectual illumination quite impossible to describe. Into his brain streamed one momentary lightning flash of the Brahmic splendor, which ever since lightened his life. Upon his heart fell one drop of the Brahmic bliss, leaving thenceforward for always an aftertaste of heaven. Among other things he did not come to believe, he saw and knew that the cosmos is not dead matter, but a living presence, that the soul of man is immortal, that the universe is so built and ordered that without peradventure all things work together for the good of each and all, that the foundation principle of the world is what we call love, and that the happiness of everyone is, in the long run, absolutely certain. The supreme occurrence of that night, Bucke said, was his initiation to the new and higher order of ideas. Within the few seconds that his illumination lasted, as his cab carried him across a sleeping London, Bucke learned more than in previous months or years of study, as well as much that no study could ever have taught. Nowadays, Bucke's experience would be chalked up to the brain's reported God spot, or, less generously, to temporal lobe epilepsy. For Bucke, it was the first glimpse of the future of humanity. We can assume Bucke discussed his experience among friends, certainly among the people who gathered around his mentor Whitman. But more than 20 years passed before he presented a version of it to his peers. In May of 1894, Bucke read a paper on cosmic consciousness at the annual meeting of the American Medico-Psychological Association. Later, in August of that year, in his presidential address to the British Medical Association in Montreal, he elaborated on his theme that a new consciousness had appeared sporadically throughout human history, and that its characteristics were becoming increasingly more common. These were signs, he believed, of a mental evolution that would eventually embrace all of humankind, transforming the species and lifting it onto an almost unimaginably higher plane. Cosmic consciousness, Bucke believed, would one day be as common as our own self-consciousness is now. And just as the appearance of self-consciousness raised humankind out of the level of the brutes, so too cosmic consciousness would raise us incomparably higher than the human. Just how high cosmic consciousness would lift the race would be made clear 7 years later, when the fruit of Bucke's extensive labors was made available to a reading public, taking its first steps into the 20th century. Although the phrase cosmic consciousness, or its shortened version, just plain cosmic, would become an all-purpose password for members of the Age of Aquarius, it is interesting and salutary to see what exactly its originator meant by it. Bucke's account of his illumination was to become a classic example of what was later called higher consciousness. Within it were the basic themes that would recur throughout a century-long discussion of the evolution of consciousness, the conviction that all is good, that the universe is not dead but living, that the human soul is immortal, and most importantly, that the source of the illumination was not outside Bucke, but came from within himself. His vision of a living universe was brief, but it had lasting effect. Among other things, it later helped reconcile him to the early death of his son. In the dedication of Cosmic Consciousness, Bucke wrote, "Through the experiences which underlie this volume, I have been taught that in spite of death and the grave, you are not dead and not really absent, but alive and well, and not far from me this moment." The immortality of the human soul, though without doubt high on the list, was not the only thing Bucke's first taste of cosmic consciousness convinced him of. He saw the development of consciousness as a gradual ascent from simple sense perception to a broader vision encompassing the entire cosmos. From the bottom up there was, Bucke argued, a kind of inverted pyramid, beginning with the simplest awareness and broadening with each higher level. There is first what he called the perceptual mind, open only to sense impressions, at the level of what he called the lower animals. Next comes the receptual mind of the higher animals, resulting in simple awareness, the kind of consciousness a dog or cat may enjoy. Above this is the conceptual mind, which only human beings have, and which produces our unique sense of self-consciousness, our awareness of ourselves, our egos, as separate entities in the world. One of the products of this form of consciousness is language, and, in a phrase that presages a discussion of language and consciousness later in his book, Bucke remarks, "Language is the objective of which self-consciousness is the subjective." Possession of language, he argues, opens an unbridgeable chasm between ourselves and the animals, and a similar chasm separates the few who now experience flashes of the new consciousness from ordinary human beings. Cosmic consciousness, the next level on the pyramid of awareness, is a higher form of consciousness than that possessed by the ordinary man. It is a consciousness of the cosmos, of the life and order of the universe, which includes an intellectual enlightenment or illumination, which alone would place the individual on a new plane of existence, would make him almost a member of a new species. And although its appearance then was still a rarity, indeed, in the last 3,000 years, Bucke was certain of only 14 bona fide cases, although there were many more of what he termed imperfect examples. Our descendants will sooner or later reach, as a race, the conditions of cosmic consciousness, just as long ago our ancestors passed from simple to self-consciousness. The result of this, Bucke believed, would be an unalloyed utopia, a veritable heaven on earth. Bucke's visionary streak was not limited to his interest in mystical awareness. Along with cosmic consciousness, he predicted other revolutionary changes for the new century. The immediate future of our race is indescribably hopeful. The two lesser radical shifts in human existence that would accompany cosmic consciousness might not match it for scope and effect, but they would nevertheless be tremendous. The establishment of aerial navigation, just getting off the ground with the Wright brothers, would abolish national boundaries and make large cities obsolete, allowing many to make their homes in the mountains and on the seashore. And people would be able to enjoy the benefits of the conquest of the air, because the 20th century, in Bucke's eyes, would see the rise and triumph of socialism. Gone would be crushing toil and the inequitable distribution of wealth, and in its place would come a new economic prosperity and social order. Such were the material conditions in which the rise of cosmic consciousness would take place. Aware of Bucke's millenarian dream, and of the realities of the last century and of our own, we may feel it almost a blessing that he did not live to see what the future actually had in store. His utopianism was not unusual at the end of the 19th century. At the tail end of the long innings of progress, the mixture of science and visionary prophecy that imbued the novels of Jules Verne, soon to find a new voice in H.G. Wells, was taken up by writers not only of fiction, but of sociology, science, and politics. The beginning of the 20th century saw a fantastic smorgasbord of new ideas, an exciting, optimistic blend of radical politics, social reform, occult beliefs, and evolutionary vision, which in the years before World War I produced a heady, effervescent atmosphere in which almost anything seemed possible. Bucke's own book was one of many arguing, in one way or another, that humanity was maturing and was now able to take responsibility for its own destiny. Such sentiments were welcomed. In the last years of the 19th century, many were concerned about the deleterious atmosphere of the decadent fin de siècle. A decade before Bucke, the doctor, journalist, and later Zionist Max Nardau had risen to worldwide fame through his book, Degeneration, 1892, which argued that the spirit of the age was rife with exhaustion, hysteria, enervation, and narcissism, evident in works of obvious degenerates like Nietzsche, Ibsen, Wagner, and Baudelaire. Earlier in the century, the book's dedicatee, Professor Cesare Lombroso, later an advocate of what would come to be called parapsychology, had advanced a theory about the criminal type and its physiognomy, and this Nardau applied to the art and literature of his time. A long section of his book is dedicated to mysticism, and he would have surely classified Bucke's experience as evidence of degeneration. His attack was shallow and hysterical, and prompted return fire, most effectively in Bernard Shaw's brilliant essay, The Sanity of Art, 1895. Yet, concern about the devolution of the white race and the threat to it from foreign influence, whether blacks or the yellow peril, informed much cultured discussion, and the attraction of a science of human betterment in the form of eugenics was strong. Bucke's book, with its emphasis on an inspiring, optimistic future, was embraced by a generation who felt that the cosmos itself was pulling humankind up to a higher level of achievement. Yet the new dawn was brief. By 1914 and the start of the Great War, the belief in progress, advance, and the perfectibility of humankind that had fueled the Enlightenment as well as more eccentric doctrines like Madame Blavatsky's theosophy, had collapsed. Bucke himself died less than a year after the publication of his book. In February 1902, after an evening discussing the theory that Francis Bacon was the real author of the Shakespeare plays, Bucke firmly believed he was, he slipped on some ice while gazing at the night sky from his veranda. He fell, hitting his head violently against a pillar, and died almost immediately. The stars that evening were exceptionally bright in the cold winter air, and one hopes it was not a momentary flash of cosmic consciousness that made Bucke lose his footing. The argument of cosmic consciousness is simple. Having himself experienced the reality of this new form of consciousness, Bucke looked back through history to see if there were other examples of it. As already mentioned, he believed, argue successfully that there had been at least 14 cases of it, ranging from ancient times to his present, with several other near hits, as it were. Many of the names he includes in his list will be repeated in similar accounts of a kind of hereditary chain of illumination stretching down the centuries. Gautama the Buddha, Jesus, St. Paul, the Neoplatonic philosopher Plotinus, Jacob Boehme, William Blake, and of course Walt Whitman are all clear examples of full and complete cosmic consciousness. Some readers may not agree with Bucke's choices. Why, for example, is the novelist Honoré de Balzac a case of complete cosmic consciousness, while Emanuel Swedenborg is classed with the lesser, imperfect, and doubtful instances? Some of Bucke's other choices also seem questionable, as do some of his remarks about primitive and backward races, and his assumption that the Aryans form a recognized higher type. But these shouldn't prevent us from grasping his basic thought that a different kind of consciousness has appeared in human beings throughout history, nor stop us from appreciating his efforts to provide us with examples. The term Aryan was around long before the Nazis appropriated it, and none of Bucke's examples of bearers of the new consciousness would have appealed to them as incidences of the master race. Although cosmic consciousness denies that life is a chance process occurring in a meaningless universe, Bucke's approach is basically Darwinian. A kind of survival of the fittest provides the physical and mental changes forming the foundation of cosmic consciousness. Just as the purely perceptual mind evolved into the simple consciousness of animals, and that consciousness was transformed into our self-consciousness, so our self-consciousness is now slowly evolving into a wider, more intuitive awareness. The trajectory is that of the simplest sensory awareness slowly widening to include the entire cosmos. Bucke argues that as we look back in history, the instances of cosmic consciousness seem rare, but in more recent years have increased and will continue to increase, just as our own self-consciousness was once the property of a few, and is now the standard by which we gauge normality. He points to the development of the color sense and our appreciation of music as other examples of faculties once absent from humankind that we now take for granted. In an example that will be often repeated by other students of the evolution of consciousness, Bucke points out that the ancient Greeks knew of only 3 colors, that in both Homer and the Bible there is no mention of the blue sky, and that a similar lack of color words can be found in ancient texts like the Rig Veda and Zend-Avesta. A comparable situation exists with the appreciation of fragrance. Bucke's basic scheme is that the history of consciousness in the race is paralleled by that in the individual, so that faculties like color sense and musical sense appear in the individual at an age roughly analogous to their appearance in humanity as a whole. A chart on the psychogenesis of man, illustrated by a few faculties, provides the parallels. We may find the chart simplistic and not entirely accurate. The idea that the musical sense appears at the age of 18 seems unsubstantiated by a large number of child prodigies, and in my own experience, my son had perfect pitch at age 2 and could carry several tunes. But the basic idea is clear. Cosmic consciousness is not a supernatural power bestowed on the elect few by the gods. It is a natural outgrowth of the evolutionary process. The individuals who could first discern brighter shades and finer hues must have stood out as freaks among their fellows, who saw the world in a drab monotone. As it is now, the individuals who today experience cosmic consciousness are a family sprung from, living among, but scarcely forming a part of ordinary humanity, whose members are spread abroad throughout the advanced races of mankind. The idea that a new race of human beings exists today, side by side with the old humanity, is one that we'll find in other writers as the 20th century progresses. In individuals, the onset of cosmic consciousness occurs around the 35th year, an age that Dante and later thinkers like C.G. Jung and Rudolf Steiner thought particularly important. Other factors are necessary, and in spelling them out, Bucke's rhetoric is, we must admit, flowery and sometimes off-putting. Allowances must be made for the copper-plated style of the book as a whole, but Bucke's talk of the necessity for an exalted human personality, the singular perfection of the intellectual and moral faculties, and an exceptional physique, exceptional beauty of the build and carriage, exceptionally handsome features, exceptional health, exceptional sweetness of temper, exceptional magnetism, strike us as the worst kind of spiritual snobbery. Likewise, his emphasis on the necessary heredity. Bucke's earnestness is naive and innocent of racial prejudice and stems, I think, from a simplistic association between physical health and spiritual advancement that is still common to much New Age thinking. It's also merely the other side of the coin of Lombroso's belief that the criminal mentality could be detected by a recognizably criminal physique. Bucke often gives the impression that a likely candidate for cosmic consciousness would be a God-fearing, golden-haired bodybuilder, and in the face of such tedious perfection, one often comes away hungry for a degenerate or two to liven things up. Yet, Bucke had certainly tapped into a powerful theme at the right time. Interest in what we call altered states of consciousness had indeed been strong throughout the 19th century. At the time Bucke published his book, one of the most popular writers on the subject was Edward Carpenter, who appears in Bucke's book as the most recent example of a full instance of cosmic consciousness. Carpenter was an interesting figure. Influential in his own time, he is little read and less discussed today. He's a perfect example of the stimulating blend of progressive ideas, evolutionary vision, mystical doctrines, and radical lifestyle that characterized the pre-World War I version of the New Age. The author of Whitman-esque verse, Bucke points to his long poem Towards Democracy as a work in which the cosmic sense speaks. Carpenter was also homosexual and an outspoken advocate of what we would call today gay rights. Carpenter's own term was homogenic love. In From Adam's Peak to Elephanta, 1892, an account of his travels in India, Carpenter gives an extended description of what he calls consciousness without thought. He speaks of this higher form of consciousness in terms similar to Bucke's. If it does exist, Carpenter suggests, it is evolving and will evolve slowly over many generations, and its appearance will be just as miraculous as that of the first incidences of simple sense awareness and self-consciousness. In this new consciousness, the familiar difference between subject and object falls away, and Carpenter relates it to several themes that will be picked up later by the Russian philosopher P.D. Wyspensky, such as the fourth dimension. And in another work, he speaks of the new consciousness enabling him to see the interior surfaces of all objects and things and persons. In this new consciousness, he is the objects he perceives, and he perceives them in a new sense that is, in effect, all the senses combined into one, an intimation of the intuition that would soon be associated with the work of the philosopher Henri Bergson. Carpenter's speculations on higher consciousness were not a rarity. Although Bucke would probably have rejected them from his canon, accounts of drug use and their effect on consciousness became a popular literary form in the 19th century, most notably in Thomas de Quincey's classic Confessions of an English Opium Eater, 1821. De Quincey's narrative of opium addiction, its visionary pleasures and hellish pains, became a much emulated investigation of the unfrequented avenues of human consciousness. In 1846, the French poet and novelist Théophile Gautier published an account of his experiences as a member of the celebrated Club des Hachichons, inaugurated in Paris by the physician and psychiatrist Jacques-Joseph Moreau de Tours. Modeled on a romantic version of the medieval Islamic sect known as the Assassins, who were believed to have used hashish in their initiation ceremonies, the club included among its members Charles Baudelaire, Gérard de Nerval, Alexandre Dumas, and Honoré de Balzac. As Balzac was one of Bucke's 14 perfect cases of cosmic consciousness, it's also interesting to speculate whether Bucke was aware of Balzac's interest in hashish, as it would surely cast doubt on his possession of a singularly perfect moral faculty and exceptional health. Most of the people involved in the club produced accounts of the resinous herb's effects. Baudelaire's classic essay, Artificial Paradise, 1851 through 60, rising above the rest for precision and scientific objectivity. In 1857, a 21-year-old poet and essayist from Poughkeepsie, New York, named Fitzhugh Ludlow, published, to much acclaim, his unabashedly derivative, The Hashish Eater, being passages from the life of a Pythagorean. Ludlow was clearly aiming at becoming the New World's De Quincey, to whose opium-inspired fantasies he added philosophical insights originating in Emerson, but enlarged by the effects of a large dose of the drug. And hashish was not the only substance offering metaphysical illumination. In 1874, Benjamin Paul Blood, a New York farmer, bodybuilder, and calculating prodigy, privately published a highly eccentric account of his experience under the gas nitrous oxide. In The Anesthetic Revelation and the Gist of Philosophy, Blood claimed that inhalation of laughing gas revealed to him the open secret, the primordial Adamic surprise of life. The philosophical implications of breathing nitrous oxide were first discovered by Sir Humphrey Davy in 1799, when, after inhaling 4 quarts of the gas, he experienced a sense of cosmic expansion, later distilled into the gnomic revelation, "Nothing exists but thoughts." But since then, the gas's powers as a spiritual agent have been eclipsed by its efficacy in obviating the pain of a still rudimentary dental procedure. Blood's vision returned the gas to its higher calling and made the history of metaphysics obsolete, as it provided an immediate, intense, and unmistakable insight into the true nature of reality. Blood sent copies of his pamphlet to as many influential people as he could think of, and although its message did not reach the world at large, it did fall into some appreciative hands. Some of these belonged to members of the newly formed Society for Psychical Research in England, who saw in Blood's 10-year self-experiment with nitrous oxide a possible means of exploring unusual states of consciousness with some scientific rigor. Another individual, also interested in psychic phenomena and unusual states of being, came upon Blood's revelation in a version of his account published in The Atlantic Monthly. The reader was so impressed by Blood's experience that he included an excerpt from The Anesthetic Revelation in his major work, which also discussed the remarkable theory of Dr. R.M. Bucke. The work was entitled The Varieties of Religious Experience, 1902, and its author was William James. This has been A Secret History of Consciousness, written by Gary Lachman, narrated by Russell Newton. Copyright 2003 by Lindisframe PR. Production copyright by Spoken Tome Media. You need to hear this.